Margaret Vaughn had 4 seconds to decide whose hands would reach the child first, hers or the bullets. 4 seconds between the screech of tires cutting across the corridor Pike strip mall parking lot and the first shot cracking the evening air like a branch snapping under the weight of something enormous and invisible. 4 seconds to grab June from the shopping cart seat to shield her to run. But Margaret was 62 years old with a left knee that had not bent properly since the fall she took restocking fabric bolts 3 winters ago. And 4 seconds was not enough time for a woman her age to do what needed doing. Someone else moved first. A boy, thin as a wire hanger, a dirty army green hoodie 2 sizes too large, sleeves pushed up past bony wrists. He came from the shadow beside the loading dock, like something the building itself had released low and fast, no hesitation, no calculation visible on his face. Just movement, pure and automatic, and aimed entirely at the 2-year-old girl in the yellow coat who had looked up at the sound of the tires and frozen the way small children freeze when the world suddenly stops making sense. He reached June in 4 seconds, scooped her off the pavement where Margaret had fumbled her grip on the cart, pulled her behind the shopping cart return shelter, covered her body with his. The bullet caught him on the way down, through the hoodie, through the skin of his left shoulder. A graze, 3 inches, shallow. The kind of wound that barely bled but would scar white and stay forever. The boy did not let go of June. Not when the second shot punched a hole through the cart return's metal siding 6 inches from his head. Not when Margaret screamed, though she did not know his name, yet screamed just the word no, the most useless word in every language, and crawled on her bad knee across the asphalt toward them. Not when the gray sedan peeled out of the lawn and disappeared south on Corridor Pike taillights swallowed by distance. He held June until Margaret reached them, until her hands found the yellow coat and the warm, small body inside it, and pulled her son's daughter against her chest, so tightly that June started crying not from fear, but from the pressure of being held by someone who understood what had almost happened. The boy sat up, looked at his shoulder, looked at the blood, looked at Margaret with brown eyes that held no surprise, as if getting shot was something that happened to people like him, and the only noteworthy part was that this time someone had seen it. Then he picked up a backpack that had been lying against the loading dock wall, put it on his right shoulder because his left shoulder was bleeding, and started walking toward the road. Margaret watched him take 3 steps before her voice came back. "Wait, stop, you're hurt." He stopped, turned halfway. The parking lot lights caught the white edge of a collarbone visible through the torn hoodie. He was small, impossibly small, the kind of small that came from years of not enough years of the body learning to survive on less, because less was all it had ever been given. "I'm okay," he said. His voice was flat, practiced. The voice of someone who had said those 2 words so many times they had worn smooth like river stones, all the sharp edges of truth rubbed away until what remained was just sound without meaning. "You are not okay. You are bleeding, and you are a child, and you just saved my granddaughter's life, and you are not walking away from me." He looked at her, really looked, and something shifted behind those brown eyes. Not trust, not yet. Something smaller and more fragile. Curiosity, maybe. The faint, dangerous curiosity of a child encountering an adult who sounded like she meant what she said. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes, 2 units. The lead paramedic, a man named Daniel, who was 34 years old, cut the hoodie sleeve wider to access the wound. He dressed the graze in 14 minutes, wrote the location on his incident report as 3847 Corridor Pike, noted the patient's age as approximately 12, noted the patient had no identification, no emergency contact, no insurance card, no parent or guardian present. Margaret rode in the ambulance with June in her arms and watched through the rear window as a second ambulance took the boy to the same hospital by a different route. She lost sight of him when the vehicles turned in opposite directions at the highway interchange, and for 11 minutes she was certain she would never see him again, that the system would swallow him the way systems swallowed children quietly and completely with paperwork instead of teeth. At West Grove Medical Center, June was examined and released in 40 minutes. A bruised elbow from the fall. No other injuries. Margaret held her in the waiting room and called Wade. Wade Vaughn was 38 years old, 6 feet tall, 214 pounds, with hands permanently stained with engine grease and a voice that went very quiet when he was afraid. He arrived at the hospital in 19 minutes, took June from Margaret's arms, held his daughter against his chest, and stood completely still in the middle of the emergency room hallway while people moved around him like water around a stone. "She's okay," Margaret said. "She's not hurt. A boy saved her. A child." He covered her with his body and took a bullet in his shoulder, and then he tried to walk away like it was nothing. Wade looked at her over June's head. "Where is he?" "They won't tell me. He's a minor. No guardian present. They said he's being processed as a voluntary runaway return." "What does that mean?" "It means he goes back into the system that put him on the street in the first place." Margaret said those words and felt them land in her own chest like stones dropped into still water. She knew what that system looked like from the inside. She had watched it take her firstborn son 23 years ago, and she had watched it give him back broken, and she had watched him break further until there was nothing left to break. His name had been Russell. Born in a spring she could still smell if she let herself. Removed from Margaret's custody when he was 8 years old, removed because she was working 2 jobs, and the apartment had failed inspection, and the caseworker decided that poverty was the same thing as neglect. Russell entered the foster care system at 8 and exited at 18 with $67 and a bus ticket and a set of behaviors he had learned in 10 years of being moved from house to group home to house, none of which equipped him to survive in a world that had never once asked him what he needed. He died at 19, alone in a motel room 2 counties over. The system that took him sent Margaret a letter. 3 paragraphs, condolences, procedural language, a phone number for grief counseling that rang to a voicemail box that was full. She kept the letter in the bottom drawer of her sewing desk for 23 years. She never opened the drawer without feeling it there, the weight of 3 paragraphs that reduced her son to a case number and a cause of death. And now tonight there was another child. Another boy the system had already decided was not worth keeping. Another child sitting somewhere in this hospital alone with a bullet wound dressed in 14 minutes and a life that fit inside a backpack. Margaret left Wade with June, walked to the intake desk, asked about the boy from the shooting, was told what she already knew. Minor patient, no information without authorization, procedure, policy, the same words, the same walls, the same gentle, immovable bureaucracy that had taken Russell and returned him emptied. She walked outside. The emergency entrance had 5 concrete steps leading down to the parking lot. The lights above the automatic doors cast a pale yellow wash across the concrete. The night was cool for late March in Tennessee. Not cold, just cool enough that a child in a torn hoodie would feel it. He was sitting on the 3rd step, backpack between his feet, left shoulder freshly bandaged, white gauze visible above the ruined fabric. He was not crying, not shaking. He was doing something Margaret recognized with a pain so deep it felt geological, felt like it came from a layer of herself that had been compressed under years of living with what she had lost. He was being still, the specific practiced stillness of a child who had learned that being noticed cost something. That movement attracted attention, and attention attracted decisions, and decisions made by adults about children almost never ended well. So he sat and waited for whatever came next. Because whatever came next always came, and he had learned that the only thing he could control was how little space he took up while it happened. Margaret walked down the steps, slowly, letting her shoes make sound on the concrete so he could hear her coming. She walked around the railing, lowered herself onto the step beside him. Not above him, not standing over him. Beside him, both of them facing the parking lot. Her knee protested. She ignored it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The parking lot hummed with the distant sound of traffic on Corridor Pike. An ambulance idled near the far entrance, its lights off, engine running. Somewhere inside the hospital, a phone rang and rang and rang. "I've been looking for you," Margaret said. "For over an hour. I need you to know that." The boy turned his head slightly. Brown eyes, close-cropped hair that looked like he cut it himself uneven at the temples. A gap between his 2 front teeth that appeared when his mouth moved, even though he wasn't smiling. "I'm okay. I heard you the first time, and I didn't believe it then either." She reached into her purse, took out a granola bar, the kind she kept for June, set it on the step between them, did not push it toward him, just set it there. He looked at it, looked at her, looked at the parking lot. "She's okay," he asked. "Your granddaughter." "She's fine. She's with her father inside. Not a scratch on her. Because of you. The boy nodded, a small mechanical motion, like he was checking something off a list in his head. Girl is safe. Task complete. Move on. What's your name? Reed. Reed what? Dixon. Reed Dixon. How old are you? 12. Margaret's throat tightened. 12. The same age Russell had been when the third placement failed and he started running. 12 years old and sitting on hospital steps at 11 o'clock at night with a bullet graze and no one coming for him and a granola bar he hadn't touched because he had learned that taking things from adults came with conditions. Where are your parents, Reed? Don't have any. Who takes care of you? The silence that followed was the loudest thing Margaret had ever heard. It lasted 7 seconds. She counted because counting was the thing she did when the world became too much, when grief or anger or helplessness threatened to pull her under. She counted and she waited and she let the silence exist without filling it. Then Reed spoke. 5 words. Quiet, matter of fact. The voice of a child stating something so fundamental to his experience that it no longer carried emotional weight. Just information. Just the way things were. She had people. I didn't. Margaret's hands went still in her lap. She understood what she was hearing. A 12-year-old had made a calculation in the middle of gunfire, whose loss would cost more, whose absence would leave a bigger hole. And he had decided in 4 seconds that his own life was worth less than a stranger's grandchild. Had decided it the way you decide to pick up a penny, automatically, without deliberation, because the answer was that obvious to him. The calculation was not wrong about June. June had a father and a grandmother and a home with a kitchen that smelled like garlic and a bedroom with a nightlight shaped like a moon. June had people who would tear the world apart looking for her if she disappeared. The calculation was catastrophically, devastatingly wrong about Reed Dixon. Margaret did not reach for him, did not put her arm around his shoulders, did not make any of the gestures that adults make when they want a child to feel comforted, gestures that she knew from 23 years of grief and guilt were about making the adult feel better, not the child. Instead, she put her right hand flat on the step between them. Palm down, present, the way you put your hand near a stray animal, not reaching, not grabbing, just there, available. You have people now, she said. That's done. Reed's jaw tightened. He had heard promises before, from caseworkers with clipboards and foster parents with spare bedrooms, and teachers who said they cared and then watched him get transferred without making a phone call. He had learned what promises cost when they broke, and the price was always paid by the child, never by the adult who made them. He looked at her hand on the step, at the weathered skin, the short practical nails, the faint indentation on the ring finger, where a wedding band had lived for 31 years before her husband Harold died of a heart attack in the driveway on a Sunday morning in October. You don't know me, Reed said. I know you covered a baby with your body and took a bullet for it. That's enough to start with. He did not respond to that, but he did not leave. And Margaret understood that not leaving was for a child like Reed an enormous act of faith. She waited. The granola bar sat untouched on the step. The parking lot hummed. Inside the hospital, the world continued to function according to its procedures and its policies and its carefully designed systems that processed children like inventory. Outside on the third step, a 62-year-old woman and a 12-year-old boy sat in silence and began the long, slow work of proving to each other that staying was possible. A car pulled into the parking lot below them, a young couple laughing about something walking toward the entrance with the easy unconcern of people whose worst problem tonight was a sprained ankle or a feverish toddler. They passed within 10 feet of the steps and did not see the boy at all. He had made himself that small, that invisible. And Margaret watched the couple disappear through the automatic doors and understood with a clarity that bordered on rage that this was the central fact of Reed's existence. He had perfected the art of not being seen because being seen had only ever brought him harm, and now the skill that had protected him was the same skill that left him sitting alone on a concrete step at night with a bullet wound and no one looking. She thought of all the people who must have walked past him in 17 days. The shoppers, the dog walkers, the teenagers on their phones, hundreds of adults, thousands going about their lives. None of them stopping, none of them asking, none of them seeing the 12-year-old boy sorting through a dumpster or curled against an exhaust vent. Not because they were cruel, because they were busy, because the architecture of their attention had no slot for a child like Reed, because seeing him would have required them to do something, and doing something was inconvenient, and so the easiest thing was to not see at all. She had been one of those people once, not with Reed, with other children, with the kids she passed at the bus stop and the gas station and the laundromat, the ones with the too thin arms and the watchful eyes, the ones she had clocked for half a second and then told herself were probably fine, probably had somewhere to be, probably belonged to someone. She had let herself believe that because the alternative was unbearable, and the unbearable thing was that some children belonged to no one. And the world had built itself to look away from them. She was not going to look away from this one. After 10 minutes, Reed spoke again, quietly, like he was testing whether the words would change anything. I've been sleeping behind the grocery store on Corridor Pike for 17 days. There's an exhaust vent on the eastern wall by the loading dock. It keeps the temperature okay. The overhang keeps the rain off most nights. He paused, counted something in his head. Margaret could see him doing it, the small movement of his jaw, the way his eyes flicked to a middle distance. It rained 4 of the 17. 2 of those nights, it got under the overhang. I put my backpack on the dry part and I sat in the wet part. You learn which parts stay dry. After a couple nights, you know the whole place, where the security camera points, when the manager does the trash run, when the trucks come in the morning so you have to be gone before 5. He said it the way a person describes a job they have grown competent at, without complaint, without self-pity, as though 17 nights of homelessness were simply a set of logistics he had learned to manage the way another child his age might describe the rules of a video game. And that was the part that nearly broke her. Not the suffering itself, though the suffering was enormous, the competence. The fact that a 12-year-old had become an expert at being homeless, had developed a body of specialized knowledge about exhaust vents and security cameras and truck schedules, had accumulated this expertise the way you accumulate any skill, through repetition and necessity, in the absence of any alternative. No child should be good at this. No child should have to be. And Reed was good at it, and he was proud of being good at it in the flat, unspoken way that survival makes you proud of the things that keep you alive. And Margaret had to look at the parking lot for a moment because her eyes had filled and she did not want him to see. Margaret listened, did not interrupt, did not react with the horror she felt because horror was about her and this moment was about him. Before that, I was at Holden Family Services, placement number 11, 14 months. The coordinator is Clifford Holden. He told me 3 weeks ago the placement was ending. Budget review, program change. Said a new placement was coming. It didn't come. Reed reached it into the hoodie's inner pocket, pulled out a phone, cracked screen, held together with a rubber band. Dead. His office door was open one night. He was on the phone. I recorded it. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He held the phone toward Margaret. The screen was dark, shattered, but the device was intact. The weight of it in her hands felt disproportionate, like holding something radioactive, something that contained energy far beyond its size. What did he say? Reed recited it from memory, word for word, the way a child memorizes something when they know no one will believe them unless they can repeat it exactly. He said the placement gets closed out Friday. He's at 11 months. That's a full stipend cycle. He said he doesn't keep them past the useful window. He goes to emergency intake. He flags the paperwork as voluntary termination. The state doesn't re-review at that classification. He said $311,700 is in the account. The audit opens in March. By March, he looks like he's running a model program. Margaret held the dead phone in both hands. $311,700. Stolen from children who had no one to steal for them, from children whose lives were measured in billing cycles and useful windows and stipend payments that continued long after the child had been pushed out the door. She thought of Russell, of the caseworker who had come to her apartment with a clipboard and a judgment and had decided that her poverty was more dangerous than the system's indifference. She thought of the 10 years her son had spent inside that system, moved from place to place, at intervals that had nothing to do with his well-being and everything to do with paperwork and funding cycles, and the convenience of adults who were paid to care for children they treated like line dormant items. She looked at Reed, at the phone, at the gauze on his shoulder, at the backpack between his feet that contained everything he owned in the world. She made a decision, not slowly, not carefully, not with the measured deliberation of a woman who weighed consequences and calculated risks. She made it the way Reed had made his decision 4 hours earlier in the parking lot. Instantly, completely. Because some decisions are not really decisions at all. They are recognitions. You see what needs to happen and you do it. And the only thing that matters is whether you are the kind of person who moves or the kind who stays frozen. Margaret Vaughn was 62 years old. She had lost a son to the system Reed was trapped in. She had spent 23 years carrying the weight of that loss, the guilt of not fighting harder, the rage at a bureaucracy that had processed her child like paperwork and returned him damaged beyond repair. She had rebuilt her life around that wound, had opened a small alteration shop on Commerce Drive, had raised Wade after Russell was taken, had loved Harold until he died, had loved June from the moment she was born. And now on the third step of an emergency room entrance at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night in late March, she recognized what was in front of her with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through something that had been overcast for 2 decades. This was the moment she had not gotten with Russell. The moment someone should have sat down beside her son and said, "You have people now." The moment that never came for him, and because it never came, everything else that happened to him happened. She could not give that moment to Russell. He was gone. She could give it to Reed. "You're coming home with me," she said. Reed stared at her, not with hope. Hope was too expensive. With the cautious, calculating look of a child trying to determine the cost of believing. "You don't know me," he said again. "You keep saying that, and you're right. I don't know you yet. But I know you don't have anywhere to go tonight. And I know the system wants to send you to the shelter until tomorrow at 6:47 in the evening, and after that to a county holding facility 34 miles from here. And I know that facility is bad because I know what a place like that did to my son." Reed's eyes shifted. Something moved behind them. The first crack in the wall. "Your son was in foster care." "My son was in foster care for 10 years, 11 placements. He aged out at 18 with $67 and a bus ticket. He died at 19. She said it plainly, without drama, without the softening language people use when they talk about dead children, the passed away and the quality and the no longer with us. She said died because Reed deserved the truth, and the truth was that the system killed her son, not with bullets, but with indifference. And she was not going to let it kill another child while she sat on a step and watched. Reed was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the granola bar, unwrapped it, took a bite, chewed slowly, swallowed. Okay. That one word, that single small exhausted syllable, it contained everything. The risk of trusting, the fear of being wrong, the desperate bone-deep need to believe that somewhere in some version of the world, an adult might actually mean what they said. Margaret stood. Her niece screamed. She ignored it, held out her hand. Reed looked at her hand for 3 seconds. Then he took it. His fingers were thin and cold, and his grip was careful, the grip of someone who had learned to hold on lightly because everything he had ever held had been taken away. They walked into the hospital together. Margaret found Wade in the waiting room with June asleep against his shoulder. She told him what had happened, told him about Reed, about the recording, about Clifford Holden, and the $311,700 in the 17 nights behind the grocery store. Wade listened. His face went through several things that were not quite expressions, more like tectonic shifts beneath the surface. The slow grinding movement of a man processing information that changed the shape of what he thought he knew about the world. Then he looked at Reed, at the gauze, at the backpack, at the 12-year-old boy who had saved his daughter's life and was standing in a hospital waiting room at midnight, holding his mother's hand like it was the only solid thing left. Wade took out his phone, dialed, put it on speaker. "Weaver, it's Wade." The voice on the other end was deep, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been woken from sleep and was already fully alert. "Talk to me. I need the chapter. West Grove, tonight." "What happened?" "A kid saved June's life tonight. Took a bullet doing it. He's 12 years old. He's been living on the street for 17 days. He's got a recording on a dead phone that proves his foster care coordinator has been running a fraud operation. 12 ghost files. $311,000 in stolen stipends. And the system wants to send him back to the man who put him on the street. Silence. 3 seconds. The kind of silence that is not empty, but full of calculations and commitments, and the sound of a man deciding how many people he is going to wake up. How many do you need? Everyone who can ride. Weaver did not ask for more details. He had worked Child Protective Services intake for 6 years before he quit. He had seen what the system did to children when no one was watching. He had seen the ghost files and the billing cycles and the useful windows, and he had quit because he could not fix it from inside, and he could not watch it happen anymore. Rolling. 2 hours, maybe less. The line went dead. Reed was staring at the phone. What did you just do? Margaret squeezed his hand. Called family. I don't have family. Wade crouched down, eye level, the way you talk to someone when you need them to hear you. Kid, you saved my daughter. You think that doesn't make you family, you're wrong. And by morning, you're going to see exactly how wrong. Reed looked at Wade. At the vest visible under his jacket, the patch of the Iron Stallions Motorcycle Club, the road name stitched below it. At the size of him, the engine grease hands, the quiet voice that had gone even quieter. Then he looked at Margaret, at the 62-year-old woman who had sat beside him on a hospital step and told him about her dead son and offered him a granola bar and held out her hand and meant it. He did not smile, but the gap between his front teeth appeared briefly the ghost of an expression he had almost forgotten how to make. They drove to Margaret's house on Oak Ridge Drive. Small, white siding, 2 bedrooms, a sewing room that used to be a 3rd bedroom, a kitchen that smelled like dish soap, and the lavender sachets Margaret kept in the cabinets. Because Harold had liked lavender, and she had never stopped buying them, even though Harold had been dead for 6 years. Margaret led Reed inside, turned on the kitchen light. The house was warm and quiet and smelled like someone lived there. Not the institutional smell of foster homes and shelters and group facilities, but the specific lived-in smell of a house where one person had made a life and maintained it and filled it with small, ordinary things that mattered to no one else. Reed stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room the way a traveler looks at a country they have read about but never visited. The magnets on the refrigerator, the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, the salt and pepper shakers shaped like cardinals, the photograph on the windowsill of a young man in a graduation gown, smiling gap-toothed, brown-eyed. Reed looked at the photograph, looked at Margaret. Your son? Margaret's throat closed. She nodded. He looks like he was happy. He was. That day he was. She left the kitchen, walked down the short hallway to the door at the end. The door she had not opened in 4 years. The door that led to Russell's room, the room she had kept for him after he left the foster system, the room she had furnished with a bed and a desk and a shelf of books. She thought he might like the room he had slept in for 3 nights before he left, for the last time the room she had closed after the phone call and never opened again. Her hand rested on the doorknob. The metal was cold. Behind this door was 23 years of grief pressed into 4 walls. Behind this door was the bed she had made for a son who would never sleep in it again. She turned the knob, pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, undisturbed. The bed was made. The desk was clear. The shelf still held the books. Dust on everything. A fine, even layer of time made visible. Margaret walked in, opened the window. Cool night air moved through the room, displacing the stillness. She pulled the sheets from the bed, folded them, set them on the desk, went to the hallway closet for fresh ones, made the bed with clean sheets and a quilt she had sewn herself, blue and white, the pattern called Log Cabin, the one her mother had taught her 40 years ago. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. It was not Russell's room anymore. It was not anyone's room yet. It was a space that had been closed and was now open, and what filled it next would depend on what happened in the morning. She went back to the kitchen. Reed was sitting at the table. He had eaten the granola bar. The wrapper was folded neatly beside his backpack. There's a room at the end of the hall, she said. Bed's made. It's yours tonight. Bathroom is the first door on the left. Towels are in the cabinet. You need anything, I'm across the hall. Reed looked at the hallway, at the open door at the end, at the light spilling out from a room that smelled like fresh air and clean sheets. Whose room is it? It was my son's. Reed understood what she was telling him. Not the words, the weight of them, the cost of opening that door. The thing she was offering him was not just a bed. It was a wound she had carried for 23 years, opened and cleaned, and made ready for someone who needed it. He stood, picked up his backpack, walked down the hall, stopped at the doorway, looked at the bed, the desk, the shelf of books, the open window where the curtain moved in the night air. He set his backpack on the floor beside the bed, sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs creaked. The quilt was soft under his hands. Margaret watched from the hallway. She did not go in. The room was his now, and entering it without invitation was the kind of thing adults did to children. In the system, walked into their spaces without asking, moved their things without permission, reminded them constantly that nothing they had was truly theirs. "Good night, Reed." He looked up. "Good night." She closed the door halfway, left the hallway light on, went to the kitchen and sat at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Wade arrived at 1:30 in the morning with June asleep in her car seat. His partner Renata came with him. They set June in the portable crib Margaret kept in the sewing room and gathered at the kitchen table. Weaver called at 1:45. 47 confirmed riders from the Tennessee chapter. A man called Graves was already on his way from Knoxville 3 hours out. A man called Mercer was bringing his laptop and equipment. A retired judge named Caldwell had been called and was reviewing emergency guardianship procedures. A clinical social worker named Wren was coming to sit with Reed in the morning to talk to him to assess what he needed without pushing. Old Dutch was coming, 73 years old. He had not ridden a night run in 4 years. He was coming. Margaret listened to Wade relay the information. The names meant nothing to her. She had never been part of the Iron Stallions, had never asked to be, had maintained a careful distance from that part of Wade's life, because the vests and the patches and the rumble of engines reminded her of a world she did not fully understand and did not need to. But tonight, that world was the only one that could move fast enough to save Reed Dixon. The system was designed to move carefully. Review periods, complaint queues, 30-day processing windows, background checks and home studies and supervisory approvals that each served a legitimate purpose, and together formed a structure that protected liability more efficiently than it protected children. Reed did not have 30 days. He had until 6:47 tomorrow evening, when the shelter bed expired and the next available placement was a county holding facility 34 miles away. The same kind of facility where a place like that had nearly broken Russell in his 15th year and given him back with nightmares he never stopped having. Margaret would not let Reed go there. That was not a decision she was still making. It was a decision she had already made on the hospital steps when a 12-year-old boy told her that a stranger's granddaughter had people, and he did not. She had made it the way bones break all at once irreversibly, and everything that followed was just the sound of the world rearranging itself around the fact of it. By 3 in the morning, Mercer had arrived. 33 years old, thin, red-eyed from the drive, carrying a laptop bag and a forensics kit and 3 gas station sandwiches he had bought on the road. He sat up at Margaret's kitchen table, ate 1 sandwich, and started working on Reed's phone. The phone was dead, the screen was shattered, but the memory card was intact. Mercer recovered the audio file in 37 minutes, played it through the laptop speakers at low volume so it would not wake Reed. Clifford Holden's voice filled Margaret's kitchen, measured, clinical, the voice of a man discussing inventory management. "The Dixon placement gets closed out Friday. He's at 11 months. That's a full stipend cycle. Everything I need. I don't keep them past the useful window. He goes to emergency intake. I flagged the paperwork as voluntary termination. The state doesn't re-review at that classification. Crace needs the corridor Pike address cleared by the 15th. The boy being there complicates the logistics. Burnett went the same way. Nobody asked questions then. Same sequence. The $311,700 is in the account. The audit opens in March. By March, I look like I'm running a model program." The recording stopped. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Margaret sat at her own kitchen table and listened to a man describe her grandchild's savior as a useful window, as a complication, as an item to be cleared from an address and replaced with revenue. She thought of Russell again, of the caseworkers who had described him with the same clinical detachment, of the language that turned children into categories, at risk, in transition, voluntarily displaced, words that sounded like help and functioned like erasure. Wade's hands were flat on the table. His jaw was tight. Mercer was already cross-referencing the recording against payment records he had pulled from public filings. 11 placements in 9 years, Mercer said. Average duration 11.3 months. Every single one cycling at the same interval. That's not a child struggling to find a fit. That's a billing cycle. Margaret looked at the laptop screen, at the numbers, at the pattern. How many children? Mercer pulled Clifford Holden's contractor file. 23 active placements currently logged in the system. He started calling addresses. By 4 in the morning, he had confirmed that 12 of those placements were empty. The children listed as actively placed had been displaced months ago, some as far back as 14 months. Holden had not filed closure paperwork. While the files stayed open, the stipend payments continued. $1,850 per child per month, 12 ghost files, average 14 months active after displacement, $311,700. The number from the recording. Exact. Margaret went to the hallway, stood outside the half-open door of the room at the end, listened. Reed's breathing was slow, regular, asleep. The first time in 17 days he had slept indoors in a bed behind a door that locked in a house where someone knew his name. She stood there for 2 minutes. Then she went back to the kitchen. Mercer had pulled something else while she was in the hallway. A name. Donna Reyes Carter. No, just Donna, the assistant manager at the grocery store on Quarter Pike, 51 years old, who had clocked in for the closing shift the night before and whose time card placed her at the store during 11 of Reed's 17 nights. Mercer had found her because he had pulled the store's incident logs looking for anything related to the shooting, and her name was on a note from 3 weeks ago. A note she had written herself and filed with the manager. Possible juvenile sleeping near East Loading Dock. Recommend we not call police, kid will just run. Watching. She saw him, Mercer said. She knew, and she didn't report it. Because she knew what reporting would do, Margaret said. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it as a fact, the same fact Cheryl, the file clerk, would say in a few hours, the same fact that lived at the center of everything. People saw, people knew. And the people who cared most were the ones who learned that the system designed to help would, if activated, only make things worse. So they watched. They left out bread. They wrote careful notes and filed them and told themselves it was enough, knowing it was not lacking any better option. Graves made a note to talk to Donna in the morning. She would become a witness. Her testimony would matter. But more than that, her note, kid will just run, would become a small, quiet piece of evidence about the thing the prosecution would have the hardest time proving, that everyone around these children understood the system was broken, and that the brokenness was not an accident, but a design, a structure that made the right thing impossible and the wrong thing automatic. 51 years old, a former State Bureau investigator who had spent 16 years in a child exploitation unit. He walked into Margaret's kitchen, nodded at Wade, nodded at Mercer, sat down and looked at Margaret. You're the grandmother. I am. Weaver told me what happened. I need to hear it from you. She told him all of it. The parking lot, the boy, the bullet, the hospital steps, the 5 words, the recording, the room she had opened at the end of the hall. Graves listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. What do you want to happen? Margaret looked at him. At the kitchen table covered with printouts and laptops and gas station sandwich wrappers. At Wade standing by the counter with his arms crossed. At the hallway where Reed Dixon slept in a dead boy's room. I want that man arrested. I want those children found. And I want Reed to never spend another night wondering if someone is coming for him in. Graves nodded. Then let's build a case. By 5 in the morning, the kitchen table was a command center. Graves had mapped the investigation into 3 tracks. 1, Holden's financial fraud. 2, the connection between Holden's ghost addresses and a distribution network run by a man named Darnell Crace, a connection that explained the shooting. 3, emergency guardianship for Reed filed under Margaret's name. What surprised Graves, what he would mention to Weaver later in the way men mention the things that genuinely move them. Which is to say, briefly and without looking directly at the person they are talking to, was how quickly Margaret took command of the table. She did not understand the forensics. She did not know what a memory card was, or how stipend fraud worked, or what jurisdiction the FBI had. But she understood people, and she understood the thing that mattered most, which was sequence. What had to happen first? What could wait? Who needed to be protected from what? When Mercer wanted to call all 23 addresses at once to confirm the ghost files, it was Margaret who said no. Start with the ones nearest the grocery store, because if Crace's network was using those addresses, a flurry of phone calls might tip them off. And if they got tipped off, they might move. And if they moved the children who were actually in some of those homes, because not all 23 were empty, some held real children in real placements, might get caught in whatever happened next. Mercer stopped, looked at her, adjusted his approach. He had been working financial crimes for a decade, and a 62-year-old seamstress had just caught a risk he had missed because she was not thinking about the money. She was thinking about the children, and the money was just the trail that led back to them. "You'd have been good at this," Graves said. "I raised two sons in a system that wanted to take them both," Margaret said. "I got good at thinking 3 steps ahead of people who had more power than me. That's all this is." Judge Caldwell called at 5:30. 65 years old and a retired circuit court judge, voice like gravel and honey. He had standing to file emergency guardianship petitions with 4 hours' notice. He had done it before. "Margaret," he said, "I've read what Weaver sent me. I can file this morning. But I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Ask." "You're 62. You live alone. You run a small business. Taking guardianship of a 12-year-old boy is not a small thing. They'll look at your age, your income, your living situation. They'll ask if you are capable. Are you sure this is what you want?" Margaret held the phone against her ear, looked at the hallway, at the door at the end. "Judge, I lost a son to the system you're asking me to petition. I spent 23 years wondering what would have happened if someone had fought harder for him, if someone had stood in front of that system and said, 'No, not this child, not today. I'm 62 years old and my knee doesn't work right, and I run an alterations shop that barely covers the mortgage. But I am absolutely sure.'" Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll be at the county courthouse at 8:47. Have the boys' consent if you can get it." Margaret put down the phone, looked at the clock. 3 hours until filing, 13 hours until the shelter bed expired, and Reed was routed to the holding facility. Wren arrived at 6 in the morning, 43 years old, a licensed clinical social worker specializing in foster care transition trauma. She had a quiet voice and patient eyes, and the specific kind of stillness that came from years of sitting with children who had been hurt by adults and needed to learn slowly that not all adults were dangerous. She sat at the kitchen table with Margaret and asked about Reed. Not about the case, not about the recording or the fraud or the legal strategy. About Reed, how he was sleeping, what he had eaten, whether he had cried, whether he had asked any questions about what was happening. "He hasn't cried," Margaret said. "He hasn't asked questions. He ate a granola bar and went to bed and said goodnight like it was any other Tuesday." Wren nodded. "That's what it looks like when a child has learned that expressing need is dangerous. He's not calm. He's performing calm because calm is what keeps him safe." Margaret understood that. She had watched Russell perform calm for years, had watched him sit at the same kitchen table during the 3 days he stayed with her after aging out, eating cereal without expression, answering questions with the same flat practiced voice Reed used. "I'm okay." 2 words that meant, "I have learned that telling you the truth will not change anything, so I will save us both the trouble." When Reed wakes up, Wren said, "I'd like to talk to him. Not an interview, not an assessment, just a conversation. I need to explain what guardianship means, what it doesn't mean, and that he gets to say no. And if he says no, then we find another way. But he has to choose. The system has been making choices for him for 9 years. This one has to be his." Reed woke at 7:12, walked into the kitchen in the torn hoodie with the bullet hole in the shoulder because it was the only shirt he had, saw Margaret at the table, saw Wren, saw the laptop and the printouts and the evidence of a long night's work spread across every surface. He looked at all of it. Then he sat down in the chair closest to the wall, back to the corner exit visible. Habit. The positioning of a child who had learned to always know where the door was. Margaret set a glass of orange juice in front of him. He drank it in 4 swallows. Wren introduced herself, explained what she did, explained why she was there, asked Reed if he was willing to talk. He looked at Margaret. Margaret nodded. "Okay," he said. They talked for 40 minutes. Wren explained emergency guardianship, what it meant, what it did not mean, that Margaret was asking to be responsible for him temporarily while the investigation into Clifford Holden proceeded, that it was not adoption. that it was not permanent yet, that it was a legal document that said Reed would stay in Margaret's home instead of going to the shelter, instead of going to the holding facility, instead of going back into the rotation that had been moving him for 9 years. Reed listened, asked questions, precise questions, the questions of a child who had signed a lot of paperwork in his life and learned that the details mattered more than the promises. If I sign this, I stay with her. Yes. For how long? Until the court reviews it. 30 to 60 days. Then a home study interviews a recommendation. And if they recommend something else, then we go to court and argue best interest. Reed looked at Margaret, at the woman who had opened a dead son's room for him and made the bed with a quilt she had sewn herself and left the hallway light on. What if I mess it up? Margaret leaned forward. Then you mess it up, and you're still here. That's how it works in this house. You don't lose your bed because you broke a rule or said the wrong thing or forgot to do something. You stay. You fix it. You stay anyway. Reed's hand shook when he picked up the pen. His handwriting was careful, practiced. The signature of a child who knew that signatures meant things changed. He signed. At 8:47, Judge Caldwell filed the emergency guardianship petition at the county courthouse. Margaret's name, Reed's consent, 30 pages of supporting documentation prepared by Graves overnight. The clerk processed the petition in 12 minutes. Emergency guardianship granted pending review. Reed Dixon was no longer in the placement rotation. He was in Margaret Vaughn's temporary legal custody. The shelter bed would expire at 6:47 that evening. It no longer mattered. Caldwell called Margaret at 9:12. It's done. Margaret sat at her kitchen table in the house on Oak Ridge Drive and held the phone against her ear and looked at the hallway where Reed Dixon was brushing his teeth with a toothbrush she had found in the bathroom cabinet still in its packaging, the spare she kept for June's visits. And she understood with the clarity of a woman who had lost one child and been given the chance to fight for another that this was the moment. Not the filing, not the signature, not the legal language. This moment, the sound of a child brushing his teeth in her hallway. The ordinary, unremarkable sound of a life that had been given permission to continue. Outside, the first motorcycles were arriving. The rumble started low distant, like weather building on the horizon. 47 engines. Chrome catching the early light. The Iron Stallions Tennessee chapter staging in formation at the public lot across from Margaret Street. Not blocking anything, not threatening anyone. Just present, visible. A wall of leather and metal and human beings who had driven through the night because a 62-year-old woman had decided that a 12-year-old boy was worth keeping, and they had decided she was right. Margaret stood at her kitchen window and watched them arrive, one by one, in pairs, in groups of 4 and 5, engines cutting off in sequence until the street was filled with the specific silence that follows a held breath. Reed came out of the bathroom, stood beside her at the window, looked at the motorcycles, at the vests, at the men and women dismounting and standing in the morning light. Who are they? Margaret put her hand on his shoulder, gently, over the gauze. They're the people who came for you. Reed stared. 47 riders. For him. A boy who had learned that he was not worth a phone call, that his disappearance would not generate a search, that his absence from a placement would be noted in a file and processed in a queue and eventually archived without anyone ever asking where he went. 47 people had driven through the night for him. His hands started shaking. He folded them together, pressed them against his stomach. The way you hold yourself when something inside is trying to come loose, something you have kept locked down for so long, you have forgotten it is there until suddenly it is not locked anymore, and the force of it is terrifying. Margaret did not tell him it was okay. She did not tell him he was safe. She did not make any of the promises adults make when children shake promises that are really requests for the child to stop showing emotion because the adult does not know how to hold it. She just stood beside him, hand on his shoulder, looking out the window at the people who had come, and let him shake. After a while he stopped, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looked at Margaret. What happens now? Now, Margaret said, we go make sure Clifford Holden never does this to another child. She picked up her purse, took Reed's hand, walked out the front door into the morning light, into the rumble and chrome, and the sound of 47 people saying with their presence what words could never adequately express. We see you. You matter. You are not alone. Margaret Vaughn had never given orders to anyone except fabric. For 31 years, she had told cotton where to fold, and silk where to drape, and denim where to hold its seam, and the fabric had listened because fabric was obedient in ways that people never were. But on this Wednesday morning, standing in her own kitchen with 47 Iron Stallions members staged across the street and a 12-year-old boy eating toast at her table, she discovered that the same quiet authority she used to reshape a garment could reshape a room full of people who were ready to move but needed someone to tell them where. Weaver came through the front door at 9:30, 56 years old, 6 feet 2, gray beard trimmed close, eyes that held the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent 6 years inside the child protective system and left because staying meant becoming complicit in the thing he was trying to fight. He looked at Margaret the way men of his generation looked at women they had not expected to be in charge, not with disrespect, with recalibration. Mrs. Vaughn, Weaver, I understand your chapter drove through the night for my boy. Margaret said it without thinking. My boy. The possessive came naturally the way breathing comes naturally, and Weaver heard it and understood what he was looking at. Not a grandmother playing hero, a woman who had already decided and whose decision was not subject to review. Yes, ma'am, what do you need from us? Margaret laid it out. She had been thinking since 3 in the morning, since the recording played through Mercer's laptop speakers, and she heard Clifford Holden describe Reed as a useful window. She had been thinking while she made the bed in Russell's room, and while she watched Reed sleep, and while she stood at the kitchen window, counting motorcycles. I need 3 things, she said. I need that recording verified and delivered to someone with the authority to act on it. I need the other children in Holden's files found and accounted for, and I need Clifford Holden to understand that what he's been doing is over. Not tomorrow, not after a 30-day review. Today. Weaver nodded. Graves, you take the evidence chain. Mercer keeps working the financial records. Caldwell's already filed guardianship. What else? I want to go to the church, Margaret said. The room went quiet. Wade, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, straightened. Mom, Cornerstone Fellowship. That's where Holden tithes. That's where he runs the benevolence fund. That's where he built the reputation that protects him. I want to see it. I want them to know what their most generous member has been paying for with stolen children's money. Weaver looked at Wade. Wade looked at Margaret. The look between them was complicated, the kind of look that passes between a son who has spent his adult life protecting his mother and a mother who has just informed him, without saying so directly, that she no longer requires protection. I'll go with you, Wade said. You'll stay here with Reed. I don't need muscle at a church. I need to look those people in the eye and tell them the truth. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, without drama. The voice of a woman who had learned that volume was unnecessary when certainty was present. Wren drove. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her purse in her lap and her hands still and her face set in the expression she wore when she was about to do something she had been afraid of for a long time and had decided to stop being afraid. Cornerstone Fellowship sat on the highway like a small city unto itself. 4,200 seats, a parking lot the size of a football field, 3 buildings connected by covered walkways, a sign out front with changeable letters that currently read, God's love is your foundation. Margaret looked at the sign, thought about foundations, thought about the foundation Clifford Holden had built for himself here dollar by dollar, tithe by tithe, with money taken from children who had no voice and no advocate, and no one to tell the congregation that their most generous member's generosity was funded by theft. 2 men in yellow safety vests met them in the parking lot before they reached the doors. Volunteer security team. The lead was in his early 60s. Retirement posture, clipboard energy. The kind of man who took his volunteer position seriously because it gave him authority he no longer had anywhere else. Can I help you, ma'am? I'm here about Clifford Holden. He runs a foster care coordination service that has stolen over $300,000 from the state of Tennessee by maintaining ghost placement files for children he displaced and abandoned. The security volunteer's expression did not change. He had been trained to remain neutral, trained to protect the congregation from disruption. And in his mind, this woman with her sensible shoes and her reading glasses on a chain around her neck was a disruption. Ma'am, Brother Clifford has served this congregation for 11 years. He runs a licensed ministry. Whatever claims you have, I'd encourage you to bring documentation to the appropriate authorities. I have documentation. I have a 4-minute recording of him describing the scheme in his own words. I have 12 ghost placement files, and I have a 12-year-old boy sleeping in my house right now with a bullet graze on his shoulder because he was living behind a grocery store after your brother Clifford threw him out like inventory past its useful window. The volunteer's jaw tightened. He looked at Wren, looked back at Margaret. I'm going to ask you to leave. Margaret did not raise her voice, did not step forward, did not make any gesture that could be interpreted as aggressive or threatening. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and 137 pounds, and she was standing in a church parking lot at 9 o'clock in the morning, telling the truth to a man who did not want to hear it. How much has Holden donated to this church in the past year? I'm not at liberty to discuss that, because it's a matter of public record. Cornerstone receives tax benefits. The benevolence fund records are semi-public. I can pull them, but I'm asking you directly. How much? Brother Clifford is one of our most generous members. Generous with what money? Because the money he's been giving you was stolen from foster children. Children who were eating from dumpsters while he wrote checks to your building fund. You want to protect him? Fine, protect him today. But when he's arrested, and he will be, this congregation is going to have to decide whether it was the foundation or the fraud that held this building up. The security volunteer did not respond. His face was the face of a man who had just been handed information he did not want and could not process in real time. He would go home tonight and think about what Margaret had said. He would lie in bed and wonder. And that wondering was the first crack in the wall that Clifford Holden had built around himself with other people's money. Margaret walked back to the car, got in, closed the door. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the release of something she had carried for 23 years without knowing she was carrying it. The rage at a system that processed children like paperwork. The guilt of not fighting harder for Russell. The helplessness of being poor and dismissed by people in positions of authority who had decided that her poverty disqualified her from protecting her own child. She had just walked into a 4,000-seat church and told the truth to a man in a yellow vest, and the truth had not killed her, and the man had not been able to make her leave. And she had stood her ground, the way she should have stood her ground 23 years ago when they came for Russell. For she had not stood her ground then. That was the wound underneath the wound, the thing she had never said aloud to anyone, not to Harold. In 31 years of marriage, not to Wade, not to herself, except in the smallest hours of the worst nights. When the caseworker came for Russell, Margaret had cried and pleaded and signed the papers they put in front of her because they told her signing was how she got him back faster, and it was a lie, and some part of her had known it was a lie. And she had signed anyway because she was 29 years old and terrified, and the woman with the clipboard spoke with the calm authority of someone who did this every day. And Margaret had believed that the system knew better than she did what her son needed. She had been wrong. The system did not know. The system did not care to know. The system needed Russell to fill a bed and generate a payment and move through a process. And what Russell needed, his mother, his home, his name spoken with love, instead of caution, was not a variable the system measured. She had spent 23 years wishing she had refused, wishing she had taken Russell and run or screamed or chained herself to the radiator, or done any of the desperate, impossible things that a mother imagines doing in the dark after it is too late to do them. And now in a church parking lot, she had finally done the thing she could not do at 29. She had refused. She had stood in front of an institution that wanted her to be quiet, and she had not been quiet. It was 23 years too late for Russell. It was exactly on time for Reed. Wren did not say anything, just drove. Let Margaret have the silence. Back at the house, Graves had been busy. He had contacted the State Department of Children's Services and spoken with a case file clerk named Cheryl, 64 years old, 21 years on the job. Cheryl had processed Reed's paperwork through 7 of his 11 placements. She recognized a ghost file when she saw one. How many files? Graves asked. 23 listed as active. I'm pulling addresses now. Give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, Cheryl called back with the confirmation that would become the backbone of the federal case. 12 of the 23 addresses were empty, no active placements. Children listed as placed had been displaced between 3 and 14 months ago. Closure paperwork never filed. Can you calculate the stipend total? $18.50 per child per month. Average 14-month gap, 12 files. Rough total, $311,700. The number matched the recording exactly. Cheryl, can you hold those files until we get a formal investigation opened? Already done, they're flagged. Nobody touches them until the Inspector General reviews. Graves thanked her. She interrupted him. Don't thank me. I should have caught this 2 years ago. I process 800 files a year. I knew something was wrong with the Holden account. The cycling pattern was too regular. But I didn't have time to investigate, and when I flagged it informally, my supervisor said it was within normal parameters. Normal parameters. That's what they called a man stealing from children. Normal parameters. Margaret heard this from the kitchen doorway. She recognized the exhaustion in Cheryl's voice. The exhaustion of a person who had seen the problem and lacked the power to fix it, and had learned to live with that powerlessness the way you learn to live with chronic pain, not by overcoming it, but by reducing your expectations until the pain and the normal became indistinguishable. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed, and the design protected liability more efficiently than it protected children. At 10:15, Mercer found the connection that changed everything. He had been cross-referencing Holden's payment records against his Cornerstone Benevolence Fund approval history. 3 payments to individuals at addresses matching active placement locations. The Benevolence Fund grants were real. The recipients were real. But the approval chain was Holden reviewing Holden using church charitable funds to pay people who provided him housing addresses, creating a second credibility layer funded by the congregation's giving. This isn't just fraud, Mercer said. This is architecture. Graves looked over his shoulder at the screen. How deep does it go? Mercer pulled up the thread connecting Holden to Darnell Crace. The Corridor Pike address where Reed had been sleeping appeared in a federal drug enforcement surveillance file under a separate case number. Holden's ghost placement files were being used as legitimate-looking residential addresses for Crace's mail drop receiving network. Holden received $800 per active address per month from Crace. That income appeared on no tax filing. The shooting had not been about Reed. It was a warning shot targeting what Crace thought was a surveillance vehicle, Wade's black pickup truck parked near the grocery store, while Renata ran inside for diapers. Wrong place, wrong night. And Reed, sleeping behind the loading dock, had been the only one paying attention when the bullets started flying. Margaret sat at her table and absorbed this. The bullet that hit Reed had been meant for a truck. The child who saved June had been collateral in a drug operation that used foster children's stolen identities as cover. The cruelty was so layered, so architectural, that it felt less like crime and more like engineering. She made everyone stop for a moment, made them eat. There was a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and a carton of eggs, and Margaret cooked while the men argued about jurisdiction and chain of custody because she had learned in 40 years of feeding people that exhausted minds make mistakes. And these minds were carrying the only chance Reed had, and she was not going to let them burn out on gas station sandwiches and coffee while they did it. Grace protested that they did not have time. Margaret set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him and said that they did not have time. That a man who collapsed at hour 36 was worth less than a man who paused at hour 38, and Graves, who had run investigations for 16 years and been managed by some of the best supervisors in the state, found himself eating eggs at a seamstress's kitchen table because she had told him to, and she was right. The thing she understood that the system never seemed to was that endurance was not the same as effectiveness. The system prided itself on endurance on the caseworkers who carried 80 files, on the clerks who processed 800 a year, on the machinery that ground on and on without rest. But machinery that never rests is machinery that stops seeing. The caseworker with 80 files does not see the child. The clerk with 800 a year does not catch the cycling pattern, even when she suspects it, because there is always another file, always another deadline, always a reason to mark something within normal parameters and move on. The brokenness was not laziness. It was overload. It was a system that had loaded so much onto each human being inside of it that the humans could no longer be human, could no longer pause and eat and notice, and so they became extensions of the machine processing instead of seeing. And children fell through the gap between processing and seeing the way Reed had fallen through it, the way Russell had. Margaret's kitchen table was the opposite of that. It was 47 people who had cleared their calendars. It was Mercer working one phone, one case, one child with nothing else on his plate. It was the luxury of attention, and the reason the system could not provide that luxury was that it had decided somewhere in its design that children like Reed did not merit it, that their cases could be carried in batches of 80, that their lives could be processed at the speed of paperwork. The Iron Stallions had not done anything magical. They had simply given Reed the thing every child deserves, and so few received the undivided attention of adults who had decided he mattered more than their own convenience. At 11:04, Graves's phone rang. Unknown number. This is Special Agent Naomi Brennan, FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I understand you have material relevant to an open federal investigation. Graves looked at Margaret. Margaret nodded. Depends on what you're investigating. Clifford Holden, Holden Family Services, foster care stipend fraud. We've been building a case for 7 months. 7 months, Margaret said from across the table. Her voice carried. Brennan heard it. Who is that? My name is Margaret Vaughn. I'm the grandmother of the child Holden's operation almost killed 2 nights ago. You've had 7 months. In that time, a 12-year-old boy was living behind a grocery store because your investigation hadn't moved fast enough to stop the man who put him there. 7 months. The silence on the line was uncomfortable. Not hostile, uncomfortable the way truth is uncomfortable when it arrives at a moment you are not prepared for it. Mrs. Vaughn, best name this, Agent Brennan said, we had the financial trail. What we didn't have was victims willing to testify. Teachers were reassigned, parents were scared, witnesses lawyered up or disappeared. We've been working this for 7 months without the one thing we needed most. We have victims, we have testimony, we have a 4-minute recording, and we have 12 ghost files with 14 months of fraudulent payments. Come see it yourself. Agent Brennan arrived at Margaret's house at 11:34. Plain clothes, practical jacket, the face of a woman who had been working too long on something that mattered too much and had not slept well in months. She stood at the front door and looked at Margaret, and Margaret looked back, and they recognized each other, not as allies yet, but as two women who understood what it cost to fight for children inside systems that moved at the speed of bureaucracy while children's lives moved at the speed of damage. Margaret led her to the kitchen. Brennan looked at the laptop, the printouts, the gas station sandwich wrappers, the evidence of a night's work conducted by people with no badges and no jurisdiction and no authority except the authority that comes from giving a damn. Mercer played the recording. Holden's voice filled the kitchen for the second time. The same measured clinical tone, the same language of revenue management applied to children's lives. When it ended, Brennan set her pen down. Where did you get this Reed Dixon? Margaret said. 12 years old, recorded it 3 weeks ago, carried a dead phone for 3 weeks waiting for someone to listen. Brennan reviewed the payment records, the ghost file timeline, the Cornerstone Benevolence Fund cross-reference, the Crace connection. She spent 40 minutes reading, making notes, asking questions that were precise and efficient, and revealed the depth of what she already knew and the specific shape of what she had been missing. She asked Mercer how he had recovered the audio from a dead phone. Mercer explained the memory card that bypassed the file structure. She asked him to write it down every step in order with timestamps because if the recording was going to survive a defense challenge, it needed a chain of custody that a forensic examiner for the government could replicate and verify. Mercer started writing. Brennan asked Graves who had handled the phone and when. Margaret said she had held it on the hospital steps that Reed had handed it to her. Brennan made a note. The phone had passed from a 12-year-old's pocket to his grandmother's hands to a forensic specialist kit, and every link in that chain would be tested in a courtroom, and Brennan was building the record now in a kitchen before there was a case because she had learned in years of financial crime work that cases were won or lost in the boring documentation that nobody saw, not the dramatic confrontations that everyone imagined. This was the part of justice that television never showed, not the arrest, the paperwork that made the arrest stick, the careful, unglamorous, exhausting labor of building something that would hold up under the scrutiny of a defense attorney whose entire job would be to find the one link in the chain that someone had handled carelessly. Margaret watched Brennan work and understood that this woman had not been slow for 7 months out of indifference. She had been slow because she was building something that had to be unbreakable. And unbreakable took time, and the time it took was time that children like Reed spent behind grocery stores. Both things were true. The slowness was both necessary and unforgivable, and there was no resolution to that, only the gap, and the gap was where Margaret in the chapter had stood. This fills a gap we haven't been able to close for 5 months, she said. Which gap? Direct victim testimony with medical corroboration and documented pattern behavior. We had the money. We had the vendor fraud set up with Crace's network. What we didn't have was proof that real children were harmed as part of the scheme, harm that Holden knew about and perpetuated intentionally. Graves laid out the final piece, Reed's hospital intake form. The nutritional deficiency markers the emergency room nurse had circled twice. Chronic, not from 2 weeks of sleeping outside, from months of insufficient meals while in Holden's placement, while Holden collected $1,850 a month for Reed's care. Brennan pulled out her phone, made a call. Her voice was clipped professional, and underneath it barely contained the sound of a woman who had been waiting 7 months for this exact moment. It's Brennan. I need a warrant package expedited. Clifford, Holden Family Services. Wire fraud, theft of federal funds, child endangerment, conspiracy to defraud the United States. I'll have probable cause to you in 90 minutes. She ended the call, looked at Margaret. I need one thing. Name it. Reed Dixon gets a victim advocate assigned before anyone interviews him. Nobody talks to him without you present and without Reed saying yes first. Margaret held Brennan's gaze. Done. Brennan gathered the documents, stood, walked to the door, stopped. Mrs. Vaughn, for what it's worth, the system I work for moves slow because it's designed to move slow. Due process, chain of evidence, judicial oversight. Every safeguard exists for a reason, but sometimes the safeguards protect the wrong people for too long. I'm sorry it took 7 months. I'm sorry it took your grandson getting shot for us to get what we needed. Margaret stood in her doorway and watched Brennan walk to her car, watched her drive away. Then she went back inside to the kitchen, to the table where the evidence was spread out like a map of everything wrong with the world, and she sat down and poured herself a cup of coffee and waited for the warrant. At 1:47, Mercer found something in Holden's Cornerstone Benevolence Fund records that added a layer to the case nobody had expected. A payment to T. Burnett, $2,400, emergency housing assistance, approved by Clifford Holden, processed 6 weeks after a settlement was finalized 3 years ago. Graves pulled the file. Theo Burnett, 6 years old at the time of placement, placed with Holden under his previous company, Cornerstone Family Placement Services, for 11 months. A school counselor referred him to a pediatrician for chronic low weight. The pediatrician filed a mandatory report. The investigation found insufficient evidence. The state paid the family $163,400 to settle. A non-disclosure agreement was signed. Holden was never charged. 4 months later, he dissolved the old company and restructured as Holden Family Services. The complaint record reset. The settlement vanished from his file. Graves called Theo's mother, explained who he was, asked if she would be willing to talk. She said yes. Rebecca Burnett was 41, worked 2 jobs, raised Theo alone after his father left when Theo was 2. 3 years ago, she had been in a financial crisis, medical bills, rent 3 months behind, an eviction notice. Clifford Holden had approached her after Sunday service at Cornerstone, said he could provide temporary placement for Theo while she stabilized, said it was legal, legitimate, safe. She believed him. Theo was placed for 11 months. Holden collected $1,850 per month. Rebecca saw none of it. At month 8, Theo's school nurse noted he had asked for crackers from the classroom supply twice in 1 week. The note went into the school file and stopped there. At month 11, the school counselor referred him to a pediatrician. An investigation opened. Insufficient evidence. A settlement offered. A non-disclosure agreement signed. Why did you sign? Graves asked. Because they told me if I didn't, the investigation would continue and I could lose custody permanently. Because I needed the money. Because I was tired and scared, and I didn't think anyone would believe me over a licensed coordinator with 11 years of church service. Do you still go to Cornerstone? Every Sunday, I sit 3 rows behind him. He smiles at me sometimes, like nothing happened. Would you testify? The pause was long. Margaret, standing in the kitchen doorway, heard it, heard the weight of it. The specific silence of a mother calculating the cost of speaking against a man who had hurt her child and been protected by every institution she had trusted. If it means another mother doesn't have to make the choice I made, yes. Margaret closed her eyes, opened them. Rebecca Burnett had sat in a church for 3 years, watching the man who had neglected her son smile at her from 3 rows ahead. Had sat there every Sunday because the church was her community, because leaving meant losing the only support system she had, because the agreement meant she could not explain to anyone why she was leaving. Margaret asked Graves if she could speak to her, not for the case, for herself. Graves looked at Brennan, who had stayed for a second pass at the documents, and Brennan said it was fine as long as they did not discuss the specifics of the testimony. So Margaret took the phone into the sewing room and closed the door and sat down among her fabric and said hello to a woman she had never met, who had made the same impossible choice she had made 23 years ago. I signed papers too, Margaret said. Long time ago, different system, same trap. They told me signing was how I helped my boy, and it wasn't, and I knew it wasn't, and I signed anyway because I didn't think anyone would believe a poor woman over a man with a clipboard and a title. Rebecca was quiet on the line. Then, did you ever stop blaming yourself? No, Margaret said. She would not lie to this woman. I didn't, but I stopped letting the blame make the decisions. There's a difference. You can carry the guilt and still do the next right thing. The guilt doesn't get a vote. It just gets to come along. Rebecca cried for a moment. Margaret let her, did not fill the silence. When Rebecca's breathing settled, she said, Theo asks about you, about the boy who got shot. He saw it on the news. He doesn't know it connects to him, to Holden, to any of it. But he keeps asking about the boy. I think it matters to him that somebody got out, that it's possible to get out. It's possible, Margaret said. Tell him that. From me. Tell him it's possible. The architecture of silence, built by a man who understood that people trapped inside systems could not tear those systems down from within, and being dismantled now one phone call at a time by 2 women who had both signed the papers and both carried the guilt and had both finally decided to speak. At 3:52, the warrant was signed. At 4:10, Agent Brennan arrived at Holden Family Services Suite 204 on Commerce Drive with 2 federal marshals and a county sheriff's deputy. Graves was across the street documenting. Margaret was in Wren's car in the parking lot of the coffee shop next door. She had insisted on being there, not to watch a man get arrested, to witness the moment the architecture collapsed. Clifford Holden was in the parking lot walking toward his car, keys in hand, phone in the other. He wore a blue Oxford shirt and khaki pants and the posture of a man who had no reason to believe his Wednesday afternoon would be different from any other. He looked up, saw the marshals, saw Brennan. His first expression was not fear. It was irritation. The irritation of a man interrupted during routine, a man whose schedule had been disrupted by something he considered beneath his attention. Mr. Holden, I'm Special Agent Brennan, FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest. On what charge? Wire fraud, theft of federal funds, child endangerment, conspiracy to defraud the United States. The irritation slipped. Something colder replaced it. Not panic, calculation. The rapid, precise calculation of a man who managed systems and understood leverage and was already in this moment thinking about lawyers and defense strategies and which version of the truth would serve him best. There's been a mistake. No, sir, there hasn't. Turn around, please. He turned slowly. Hands came up automatically. The marshals cuffed him, read him his rights in the parking lot under the afternoon sun, in front of the office building where he had managed the lives of 23 children, like a portfolio of investments, cycling them through at regular intervals, maximizing the return, archiving them when their useful window closed. Margaret watched from the coffee shop parking lot. She watched his face, watched the moment he understood that the handcuffs were real, that the charges were real, that the careful architecture he had built over 7 years was collapsing because a 12-year-old boy had stood in a hallway with a cracked phone and recorded 4 minutes of truth. She did not feel satisfaction. She had expected to, had expected the sight of Clifford Holden in handcuffs to fill the hole that Russell's death had left. It did not. Nothing would fill that hole. Russell was dead and no arrest would bring him back, and no amount of justice applied to someone else's crime would retroactively protect her son from the system that had consumed him. What she felt instead was something quieter, something that had no name in English but might have been described as a sensation of a debt being paid by the wrong person to the wrong creditor in the wrong currency, and yet somehow imperfectly, inadequately, the balance shifting closer to zero than it had been before. The marshals found the locked filing cabinet in Holden's office an hour after the arrest bottom drawer, a combination padlock. They opened it with a court-authorized locksmith at 4:47. Inside were 23 placement files, each with a handwritten notation in blue ballpoint, abbreviations, dates, dollar totals. Beside each child's name, a phrase useful window 11 to 14 months. Beside the closure dates that were never filed, extend dollars. The files were not hidden in any meaningful sense. They were organized, alphabetized, maintained with the same care Holden applied to everything else. He had not been ashamed of them. He had not buried them in a wall or shredded them or kept them in some secret location. He had filed them in a cabinet in alphabetical order because, to him, they were not evidence of a crime. They were records of a business. A man who knows he is doing evil hides the proof. A man who believes he is simply managing resources files it neatly and labels the drawer. Reed Dixon's file was the last one, file number 23. The notation beside his name read UC November to January. Window closes February 15th. Archive after audit. UC useful cycle. Reed had been useful to Clifford Holden for 14 months. And when his usefulness expired, Holden had displaced him and kept the file open so the stipend would continue and the revenue model would not break. That was what Reed had been in the ledger of the man who controlled his life. Revenue, a useful cycle, a line that generated $1,850 a month until the window closed. And the only reason he was not still sleeping behind a grocery store, the only reason he was alive at all, was that he had decided in 4 seconds in the middle of gunfire that a stranger's daughter was worth dying for. And a woman on a hospital step had looked at him and seen her own dead son and refused to let the cycle close. Grace photographed the files, Brennan logged them. They would become the centerpiece of the trial, not the recording in the end, though the recording was what people remembered. But these files, these neat alphabetized records in a man's own handwriting, because a jury could forgive a recording as a moment of careless talk, but could not forgive a filing system. The filing system proved it was not a moment. It was a method. She went home. Reed was on the couch. Wade sat in the armchair. June was on the floor with crayons. The television was off. The house smelled like the soup Renata had made, chicken and vegetables, the kind of meal that took 3 hours and filled every room with warmth. Reed looked up when Margaret came in, read her face. He had spent 9 years learning to read adult faces to decode expressions for threat and intention and the subtle shifts that preceded bad news. They arrested him? Yes. Reed was quiet. His hands were in his lap. The backpack was on the floor beside the couch, still within reach, still close enough to grab. Is it really over? Margaret sat beside him. The arrest is done. The trial will take time. 6 months, maybe more. They'll build the case. There will be lawyers and hearings and paperwork. But he can't hurt you anymore. He can't hurt anyone anymore. Reed looked at his hands, at the fingers that had held a dead phone for 3 weeks, at the hands that had covered a 2-year-old girl's body while bullets flew. What happens to the other kids, the ones in his files? Margaret looked at Wade. Wade nodded. They're being found, Margaret said. Every one of them. Graves in the chapter are working with the state and the FBI. 12 children whose files were kept open after they were displaced. Some of them are in other placements. Some of them may be in situations like yours was. They're going to find every single one. Reed nodded, looked at the soup bowl Renata was holding toward him, took it, held it in both hands, the warmth of it against his palms. Can I have bread with this? Renata smiled. Already cut. She set a plate beside him, 3 slices, butter on the side. No timer, no rationing, no performance required. Reed ate, slowly at first, then steadily, the way a body eats when it has been given permission to be hungry without consequence. He finished the soup, ate 2 slices of bread, left the third. I can save this for later. Margaret's chest tightened. The question, the specific, devastating question of a child asking permission to keep food, asking if later existed. asking if the abundance of this moment was temporary or if it might impossibly continue. It's yours. You eat when you're hungry. You stop when you're full. There's always more. Reed looked at the bread, at the kitchen, at the house that was not his but felt safer than anywhere he had been in 9 years. Okay. That night, Margaret sat on the front porch after Reed went to bed. The street was quiet. The motorcycles were gone. The Iron Stallions had begun pulling out that afternoon in twos and threes, heading back to their lives and their home and their families. Weaver was the last to leave from the staging area. He stood at Margaret's front gate, hands in his vest pockets, and looked at her. You did something today, Mrs. Vaughn. Not us. You. You walked into that church. You stood in front of Brennan and told her the truth. You opened that room for that boy. The chapter showed up because Wade called, but you're the reason any of it happened, because you sat on a hospital step and decided a stranger's child was worth fighting for. Margaret looked at him. I didn't decide. I recognized him. He was my son, not the same boy, but the same system, the same invisibility, the same silence. I couldn't save Russell, but I could make sure that when Reed spoke, someone listened. Weaver nodded, held out his hand. Margaret shook it. His grip was firm, callous, the grip of a man who respected what he was touching. Can I ask you something? Margaret said. Why'd you leave the work? You said you did 6 years inside the system. Why'd you stop? Weaver was quiet for a moment. The streetlight caught the gray in his beard. Because I figured out I was the gap, he said. I used to think the system was broken, and people like me were patching it, holding it together. Then I worked a case of girl about Reed's age, and I did everything right, filed everything on time, followed every procedure, and she still ended up somewhere that hurt her. And when I went to my supervisor, he told me I'd done my job. And that was the thing that broke me. I'd done my job. The job was the problem. The job was designed so that you could do everything right and a child could still be destroyed and nobody would have failed because failure wasn't measured in children. It was measured in paperwork. And I was good at the paperwork. I was a good, that's all being good at the job meant. Being a good keg in a machine that ground kids up. He looked at her street, at the dark houses, at the place where 47 motorcycles had stood that morning. So I quit, and I spent a few years angry. And then Weaver found me, the man whose road name I took. He's gone now, and he showed me you don't have to fix the machine to save a kid. You just have to get to the kid before the machine does. That's all the chapter is. We're not heroes. We're just faster than the paperwork. We get there first. Margaret thought about that for a long time after he left. You need anything, you call Wade. He calls us. That's how it works. He walked to his bike, started the engine. The rumble filled the quiet street for a moment, then faded as he turned the corner and was gone. Margaret sat on the porch and listened to the silence that followed. Not empty silence, full silence, the kind that exists in a house where a child is sleeping safely, where the doors are locked from the inside instead of the outside, where the hallway light is on because someone remembered to leave it on. She thought about Russell, about the 3 nights he had slept in the room at the end of the hall before he left for the last time, about the things she should have said and did not, the fights she should have fought and could not, the system she should have challenged and was too poor and too scared and too alone to confront. She was not too poor anymore. She was not too scared, and she was not alone. She went inside, locked the door, walked down the hallway, stopped at Reed's door open halfway the way he preferred it. He was asleep, the quilt pulled up to his chin, the backpack on the floor beside the bed still within arm's reach. On the desk beside the window, the laminated school photo from 4th grade, a yellow polo shirt, almost smiling. He had set it there the first night, not in a frame, not hidden, just there, visible. Margaret looked at the photo, at the boy in it, at the boy in the bed, same brown eyes, same gap between the front teeth, same careful, practiced expression of a child who had learned not to want things because wanting hurt more than not having. She pulled the door to the halfway point, left the hallway light on, went to bed. And for the first time in 23 years, the door at the end of the hall was open and the room behind it held a living child, and Margaret Vaughn slept knowing that tomorrow she would wake up and the child would still be there. That was the thing about saving someone. It did not feel like heroism. It felt like waking up. The first doctor's appointment happened Thursday morning at 9:15. Margaret drove. Her car was a 12-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper from the time Harold backed into a mailbox the last year he was alive. The passenger seat still had the booster seat clip. Marks from June's car seat, and the glove compartment held 3 lavender sachets, a tire pressure gauge, and a photograph of Russell at age 7 that Margaret had never been able to remove and never been able to look at without pain. Reed sat in the passenger seat with his backpack on his lap, still holding it, still not able to set it down. The backpack was his portable room, his proof of existence, his guarantee that if everything collapsed again, he could stand up and walk and carry what mattered with him. Margaret did not tell him to put the backpack in the back seat. She understood what it meant. She had watched Russell carry a plastic bag with his things for the first 2 weeks after each placement, change the bag pressed against his chest like a shield, and she had learned that the thing being held was never really the bag or the backpack. It was the fear of arriving somewhere and having nothing that belonged to you. The waiting room at the family medicine clinic smelled like hand sanitizer and the specific industrial carpet cleaner that all medical offices use, and that always, regardless of the brand, smells like someone is trying very hard to eliminate the evidence of human suffering. Reed sat in the plastic chair closest to the exit, backpack on his lap, eyes tracking the room, counting the people, the exits, the distances between himself and every potential threat, the way an animal tracks its environment when it has been hunted before and knows that safety is a temporary condition. Margaret sat beside him, did not tell him to relax, did not tell him everything was fine, because everything was not fine. A child who calculates escape routes in a waiting room is not fine, and pretending otherwise is the kind of lie that adults tell themselves to avoid confronting the depth of what has been done to the children they are supposed to protect. When the nurse called Reed's name, Margaret stood. "You want me to come with you?" Reed looked at the hallway, at the exam rooms, at the nurse waiting with a clipboard. He had been to doctors before. Foster placements required medical clearance, weight recorded, height measured form, signed in next placement processed. Those visits had been transactions, brief, efficient, impersonal. The doctor was another adult with a clipboard who would examine him and release him back into the system without asking a single question about whether the system itself was the thing that was hurting him. "Yeah," he said, "please." Dr. Patricia Hollis was 52. She spoke quietly and moved slowly enough that Reed could track what she was doing before she did it, a practice she had developed over 20 years of treating children who had been in the foster care system and who associated sudden adult movement with threat. She reviewed the hospital intake form, looked at the nutritional deficiency markers the emergency room nurse had circled twice, ordered blood work. The results came back while they waited. Vitamin D deficiency, iron deficiency, protein malnutrition. Not acute, chronic, the kind that developed over months of insufficient meals, the kind that a body produces when it has learned to survive on less, because less is what it receives, the kind that leaves marks in the blood, the way rings mark the inside of a tree. Each deficiency, a season of deprivation made measurable. Dr. Hollis printed the results, sat across from Reed with the paper between them, spoke directly to him, not to Margaret, not over him, not around him. "This isn't your fault. You understand that." Reed did not answer, but his jaw loosened slightly, which was as close to acknowledgement as he was able to give. "Your body didn't get what it needed for a long time. We're going to fix that. Supplements, meal plan, follow-up in 4 weeks. You're going to feel different when your body isn't running on empty." She paused. Then she did something Margaret had not expected. She turned the paper around so Reed could see it, and she pointed to each line and she explained what it meant. Not in the simplified way adults talk to children, but plainly as though Reed were a person who deserved to understand his own body. The vitamin D, she said, was why he probably felt tired in a way that sleep did not fix. The iron was why he might have felt his heart race when he climbed stairs, why he might have felt cold even when it was not cold. The protein was the foundation, the thing the body used to repair itself, and his body had been trying to repair itself for years without the materials to do it. "Your body did an incredible job," she said. "It kept you alive on almost nothing. That's not weakness. That's the opposite. But it can't keep doing that, and it doesn't have to anymore. So we're going to give it what it's been missing, and it's going to start using all that energy it's been spending just to survive on actually living instead." Reed looked at the paper, at the lines, at the numbers that quantified in clinical terms 9 years of not enough. And something in his face changed, some small relaxation around the eyes, because for the first time an adult had looked at his body and not seen a problem to be processed, but a remarkable thing that had carried him through more than it should have had to. No one had ever told him his body had done an incredible job. People had told him he was small. People had told him he needed to eat more, as though the not eating were a choice. No one had ever framed his survival as an achievement. She handed him a prescription slip and a printed meal plan. Specific foods, specific portions, specific times. Someone had thought about what his body needed, had written it down, had made it a plan instead of a hope. Reed folded the paper carefully, put it in his hoodie pocket beside the laminated school photo. Two documents that mattered. One was a picture of who he used to be. The other was a plan for who he could become. Margaret drove home, made grilled cheese, 3 sandwiches. Not because Reed asked for 3, but because the meal plan said protein and calories, and Margaret had been feeding people for 40 years and knew that food was never just about food. It was about the absence of timers, the absence of rationing, the absence of someone watching you eat, like eating was a test you could fail. She set the plate in front of Reed, sat across from him with her own sandwich. Ate. Did not watch him eat. Just let the kitchen be a kitchen and the meal be a meal, and the silence be the comfortable kind, the kind that exists between people who are learning to share a space without needing to justify their presence in it. Reed finished 2 sandwiches, set down the third halfway through. I can't finish it. That's all right, I'll wrap it up. You can have it later. I can. Margaret's hands went still. A 12-year-old boy asking permission to save food, asking if later was allowed, asking without knowing he was asking whether the concept of tomorrow applied to him, whether there would be a tomorrow in this kitchen, at this table with this woman who had opened a dead boy's room and made it his. Yes, it's yours. You eat when you're hungry. You stop when you're full. That's how it works here. Reed looked at the half sandwich, at the kitchen, at the magnets on the refrigerator, and the Cardinal salt shakers and the photograph of Russell on the windowsill. Okay. The first weeks were made of 1,000 small recalibrations, none of them dramatic, all of them enormous. Margaret learned to announce herself before entering a room because Reed startled if someone appeared in a doorway without warning, his whole body going rigid before his mind caught up. She learned to leave the bathroom door unlocked from the outside because Reed checked the first few nights whether the doors in the house could trap him. And she watched him check and said nothing, and simply made sure that no door in her home could ever lock a child inside. She learned that he hoarded not greedily, but carefully, a granola bar squirreled into his backpack, a roll from dinner wrapped in a napkin and tucked into a drawer. And she learned not to comment on it, not to clean it out. Because the hoarding was not a problem to be corrected, but a wound that would heal on its own timeline once his body finally believed that food would keep coming. She bought more granola bars. She let the drawer fill. And one morning, weeks later, she found the hoarded food gone, not eaten, just gone, quietly returned to the kitchen because some part of Reed had finally decided he did not need the emergency stash anymore. And Margaret had stood in the kitchen and held the empty drawer and wept for the second time since he came. He flinched at raised voices, even on the television, even in cheerful arguments between game show contestants. He apologized constantly for things that needed no apology, for using too much hot water, for finishing the milk, for existing in spaces in ways that took up room. Margaret stopped saying it's fine because she noticed it did not land. The words slid off him like rain off a roof. Instead, she started saying, you don't have to apologize for that, naming the specific thing. You don't have to apologize for drinking. Milk. Milk is for drinking. That's what it's for. And slowly over weeks, the apologies thinned. He did not know how to be bored. This surprised her most of all. A child who had spent 17 nights behind a grocery store, whose every waking hour for 9 years had been organized around survival and watchfulness, did not know what to do with unstructured safety. The first Saturday with nothing scheduled, Reed sat at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning, dressed, backpack, ready, waiting for instructions. And when Margaret told him there were no instructions, that Saturday was for whatever he wanted. He looked at her with something close to panic, because whatever he wanted was a concept he had no equipment to process. He had never been asked what he wanted. He had been told where to go and when his entire life, and the absence of being told was not freedom to him. It was a void. So Margaret taught him. Not what to want, she would not make that mistake, but how to want. She put options in front of him, small ones at first. Did he want cereal or eggs? Did he want to come to the shop with her or stay home and read? Did he want the blue shirt or the gray one? And each time he chose each tiny act of preference was a muscle he had never been allowed to use, and she watched it strengthen. By the third week, he chose without the long, terrified pause. By the second month, he was disagreeing with her, gently testing about what to watch, what to eat, whether he really needed a jacket. And every disagreement was a small miracle because a child who disagrees is a child who believes he is safe enough to have a self, and Reed was building a self in real time in her kitchen, out of cereal choices, and shirt colors, and the radical permission to want things. That evening, the legal framework settled into place around them like a house being built in real time, each beam and bracket set by someone who understood that the structure had to hold. Caldwell called with the guardianship update. Emergency order in place. Review in 30 to 60 days. Home study interviews recommendation. Standard process. And if they recommend something else, Reed asked. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his math homework open in front of him, the first homework he had done in 17 days, and his voice was quiet and careful. The voice of a child who had learned that adults made decisions and children lived with them. Caldwell's answer came through the speakerphone. Then we go to court and argue best interest. But I don't think that's where this lands. Margaret has a clean background, stable home, documented consent. After what Holden did, the state is going to be very careful about moving you anywhere that looks even remotely unstable. So I stay, you stay. Wade leaned against the counter, cleared his throat. The chapter raised $19,200 from 3 chapters in 72 hours. Tennessee Knoxville and a group from Alabama that drove through the night. That money is for whatever Reed needs. School supplies, clothes, therapy, medical. It's his. Reed stared. $19,000. From people he had never met. Why? Old Dutch answered. He had arrived at 5 that afternoon, 73 years old, riding from Nashville on a bike that was older than Wade. He had been sitting in the corner of Margaret's living room for 2 hours without speaking. His presence filled the room the way silence fills a cathedral, not by adding sound, but by making the existing sounds feel more significant. Because you covered a baby with your body and took a bullet meant for someone else. Because you carried evidence for 3 weeks waiting for someone to listen. Because you mattered before anyone told you that you did. Reed's hands were shaking. He folded them in his lap. Margaret reached across the table and set a key beside his homework. Small, brass, newly cut. Front door, this house. Your room is at the end of the hall. You know which one. Reed picked up the key, held it. The metal was cool against his palm, solid real. He had been handed keys before. Temporary placement keys that worked until the paperwork changed and suddenly they did not, and nobody explained why. Keys that meant you could enter a space but never meant the space was yours. This key felt different, not because the metal was different, because the woman who handed it to him had opened a door she had kept closed for 23 years, and behind that door she had placed clean sheets and a quilt she had sewn herself, and she had done it knowing that the child who slept there would never be the child she had lost, and that the love she gave him would never bring Russell back, and that none of that mattered because love was not a transaction and children were not replaceable, and the only thing that mattered was whether you showed up when it counted. Thank you. Margaret's voice was rough. You don't thank family for showing up. You just show up. The brothers left on Friday morning, in 2s and 3s. The Knoxville contingent pulled out first 23 bikes formation tight. The Alabama group followed. Mercer packed his laptop at Margaret's kitchen table. He had not slept more than 4 hours since Tuesday night. He had produced the forensic analysis that would become the evidentiary foundation of the federal case. He stood stretched, looked at Reed. That recording you made, those 4 minutes and 12 seconds, that's going to be the first exhibit. Every news story about Holden, every training program about foster care fraud, they're going to reference that phone. A cracked phone held together with a rubber band. And they're going to know that a 12-year-old boy carried that evidence for 3 weeks because he believed someone would eventually listen. You did that, not us. We showed up. You were already the hero before we got here. He left before Reed could respond. Graves came next, crouched in front of the couch so he was at Reed's eye level. The state is going to assign you a new caseworker. You're going to have a victim advocate for the trial. You're going to have a therapist when you're men. Yeah, my ready. And you're going to have Margaret, who is the most stubborn woman I've ever met, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. What if I mess up? Then you mess up. That's what kids do. Margaret's not going to send you away because you forgot to take out the trash or got a bad grade or said something you regret. That's not how this works. How does it work? You stay, you mess up, you fix it, you stay anyway. That's family. Old Dutch was the last to leave. He stood at the front door with his vest and his keys and looked at Reed for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn leather wallet, opened it, took out a photograph. Black and white, creased, faded. A boy, maybe 8 years old, standing in front of a chain-link fence. Alone. That's me, 1953. State ward, nobody came. He held the photo for 3 seconds, then put it back. Somebody came for you. He walked out. The engine started. The rumble faded down Oak Ridge Drive until the street was quiet again. Reed stood at the window and watched until the last bike disappeared. Then he turned and looked at Margaret, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder and the expression of a woman who had just watched an army leave and understood that the real battle, the daily one, the one fought with grilled cheese sandwiches and clean sheets and showing up at 3:15 was hers. They're really gone. They'll be back. Chapter meeting second Thursday of every month. You're invited, not required. What do I do now? Margaret walked to him, put her hand on his shoulder. The good one. Now you just be a kid, do homework, eat when you're hungry, sleep without listening for doors. Figure out what you like, mess up, try again, be 12. I don't know how to do that. Then we'll figure it out together. 6 days after the arrest, Reed went back to school. The middle school enrolled him in 7th grade. Margaret drove him, walked him to the office, stood beside him while the secretary processed the enrollment paperwork, explained the schedule, handed over a locker combination on a yellow sticky note. Reed looked at the hallway, at the lockers, at the kids moving between classes like this was normal. You're leaving. I'm going to the shop. I'll be back at 3:15. Right here. This spot. What if you're not? Margaret crouched. Her knee protested. She ignored it, eye level. The way you talk to someone when you need them to believe you. I will be here at 3:15. If I'm late, traffic, flat tire, fabric emergency, I will call the office and they will tell you. But I will be here. You don't get left anymore. That's done. Reed's throat was tight. He nodded. Margaret stood, walked down the hallway, out the front doors, got in the sedan, drove to her shop on Commerce Drive, opened the door, turned on the lights, sat at her sewing table, and cried. Not the polite, manageable tears of a woman being brave. The deep, shaking, whole-body weeping of a woman who had just walked out of a school building after leaving a child who trusted her, and the trust of that child was the most terrifying thing she had ever been given, more terrifying than losing Russell. Because losing Russell had been something that happened to her, and this was something she had chosen. And if she failed Reed the way the system had failed Russell, there would be no one to blame but herself. She cried for 11 minutes. Then she washed her face in the shop bathroom, made a cup of tea, started hemming a pair of trousers for a customer who was coming at noon. And at 3:15, she was in the parking lot of the middle school in the exact spot she said she would be. Reed walked out the front doors, saw the sedan, stopped, stood there for 3 seconds, then walked to the car and got in and put his backpack between his feet. How was it? Okay. Just okay. I didn't know anybody. Everybody already has friends. That'll change. What if it doesn't? Then it doesn't, and you're still okay. You don't need 100 friends. You just need people who show up. It changed slowly the way everything with Reed changed slowly. There was a boy in his science class named Marcus, a different Marcus than the paramedic, a 13-year-old who collected facts about deep-sea creatures, the way some kids collected trading cards, who sat next to Reed by the accident of alphabetical seating and started talking to him about anglerfish without requiring Reed to talk back. Reed told Margaret about him after the second week, not as news. Just as a fact dropped into the dinner conversation, there's a kid in science. He knows everything about fish that live where there's no light. Margaret asked what kind of fish. Reed told her, at length, with a kind of animation she had not seen in him, and she realized he was not really telling her about the fish. He was telling her that someone had talked to him for no reason except that they wanted to, and it had not cost him anything. And he was turning the experience over in his mind like a stone he had found and could not quite believe was his to keep. By the end of the school year, Reed and Marcus were eating lunch together. By the following year, there were 3 of them, then 4. Reed never had a wide circle. He was not built for it. 9 years of impermanence had taught him to invest carefully in small numbers, in people he had watched long enough to trust. But the people he chose, he kept, and they kept him. And that Margaret came to understand was its own kind of healing, not becoming someone who trusted everyone, which would have been a betrayal of everything his life had taught him, but becoming someone who could trust a few deeply and let those few become the people who showed up. That night after dinner, spaghetti made by Margaret with garlic bread and a salad because the meal plan said vegetables, and Margaret had decided that following the meal plan was the bare minimum, and exceeding it was the goal. Reed went down the hall to the room at the end. His room. He sat on the bed, took out the laminated school photo, set it on the desk, not in a frame, not hidden, just there, visible. Beside it, he set the brass key. 2 objects, one from before, one from now, and between them the distance a life can travel in 4 days, from a loading dock exhaust vent to a room with a quilt and a desk and a window that looked out on a quiet street where nothing dangerous had ever happened, and where if Margaret Vaughn had anything to say about it, nothing dangerous ever would. 14 months later, Reed turned 13 in Margaret's kitchen. Chocolate cake. His favorite, though he had not known he had a favorite until Margaret asked him what kind he wanted, and he stared at her for 10 seconds trying to remember if anyone had ever asked him that question before. 17 people came. Not a party, just people. Wade and Renata and June, now 3.5, calling Reed by name, asking him to read her the book about the duck. Wren, Graves, 3 brothers from the chapter who happened to be in town. Old Dutch, who sat in the corner and ate 2 slices of cake without speaking and left a card on the table that said in handwriting so precise it looked typeset, "Proud of you," they sang. Reed blew out the candles, made a wish he did not say out loud. Afterward, when people had left and the kitchen was clean and June was asleep in the sewing room, Reed sat on the porch steps with Margaret. Late spring, warm, crickets in the trees. "You know what's weird?" Reed said. "What I don't count days anymore." "What do you mean?" "I used to count every days since I left a placement, days until the next visit, days since I ate. I don't do that anymore. I don't know when I stopped. I just did. I started counting different things instead. Days since I got an A on a test, days until summer break, days since I beat you at chess." "You haven't beaten me at chess?" "I will." Margaret smiled. "Yeah, you will." Reed looked at the street, at the quiet neighborhood, at the normal he had been learning for 14 months. "Can I ask you something?" he said, "and you have to tell me the truth, not the nice version." "Always the truth," Margaret said. "I promised you that on the steps. I haven't broken it yet. When you look at me, do you see him, your son?" "Russell." He had learned the name slowly over the months, had earned his way into knowing it. "Am I just the kid you got to keep because you lost the one you wanted?" Margaret did not answer quickly. She owed him a real answer, and a real answer required her to be honest about a thing she had wrestled with privately in the early weeks when she had caught herself watching Reed eat and seeing Russell at the same age, when the grief and the gratitude had tangled so tightly she could not tell which was which. "At first," she said, "at first, yes. The first night when I made up that room, I wasn't entirely making it for you. I was making it for the boy I never got to save. You're right about that, and you deserve to know it. But here's the truth, the whole truth. Somewhere in those first weeks, you stopped being him. You became you. You hate cilantro, which Russell loved. You read at the kitchen table with your foot tucked under you, which Russell never did. You laugh at things he wouldn't have found funny. You are not a replacement for my son Reed. You couldn't be, and I stopped wanting you to be. You're a whole separate person I got to love, and the loving of you doesn't fix the losing of him. They're 2 different things living in the same heart. I lost Russell, and I found you. Both true. Neither one cancels the other. Reed was quiet. He looked at the porch boards. That's a better answer than the nice version, he said. I told you. The truth. Okay. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. Okay, I needed to know I wasn't a ghost. That you weren't just looking through me at him. You're not a ghost, Margaret said. You're the most solid thing in my life. You're the reason I get up. And not because you're standing in for anybody. Because you're you. The adoption paperwork got finalized last week. I know, I signed it. Caldwell said it's permanent now. Like legally permanent. That's what permanent means. I'm just making sure. Because I've had legal things before and they changed. Margaret turned to look at him. This one doesn't change. You're stuck with me. Even when you're 16 and think I'm the most embarrassing person alive. Even when you go to college and I call too much. Even when you're 30 and you've got your own life and you're tired of me asking if you've eaten. You're stuck. Reed's throat was tight. Good. They sat for a while, not talking, just there. Then Reed spoke. I want to do something. What? There's a program at school, peer mentoring, for kids who are new or struggling or don't have people. I want to sign up. You sure? I know what it feels like to be new, to not have people. I don't want other kids to feel like that if I can help. Margaret's chest tightened, the same way it had tightened on the hospital steps 18 months ago, when a 12-year-old boy said she had people. I didn't. And she understood what she was looking at. A child who had never been chosen choosing to be the person who showed up for someone else. Then sign up. 4 years after the night at the grocery store, Reed Dixon was 16, a junior at the high school, honor roll every semester since freshman year, peer mentor coordinator, volunteer at a foster youth alliance, planning to study social work after graduation. He did not talk about what happened often, but when the school counselor asked if he would be willing to speak to a new student, a 15-year-old girl named Maya, recently placed with a local family after cycling through 6 placements in 4 years, he said yes. They met in the counselor's office. Maya sat across from him, quiet, hands folded in her lap, eyes that did not quite look at you straight on. The posture Reed recognized immediately because he had worn it himself for 9 years. She looked up after a long silence. They said you were in foster care. I was. 9 years, 11 placements. How many times did they say it would get better? Every time. Did you believe them? She shook her head. Reed leaned forward, not crowding, just present. I didn't either. For a long time, I didn't believe anyone. Because every time I did something, changed and I got moved. And I learned that believing people was how you got hurt. So what happened? I met someone who didn't ask me to believe her. She just showed up. Every single day. Until I couldn't not believe her anymore. Hutarm, my grandmother. Maya's expression shifted. I thought you were in foster care. I was. She adopted me when I was 13. She wasn't my grandmother when I met her. She was just a woman whose grandchild I helped. But she showed up, and she kept showing up. And one day I realized I'd stopped counting the days until she'd leave, because she wasn't going to. Maya looked at her hands. I don't have anyone like that. You might. You've got the family you're placed with now. I've had families before. I know, and I'm not going to tell you this one's different. I don't know if it is. What I know is that you get to decide if you want to try. And if you do and it doesn't work, that's not your fault. That's the system. That's the adults. That's never you. What if I try and it does work and then I mess it up? Then you fix it. That's what family does. They don't leave because you mess up. They stay and help you figure it out. How do you know? Because I messed up 100 times and I'm still here. Maya looked at him, at the 16-year-old who had survived it, who was sitting across from her, now calm and present, proving that making it out was possible. Does it get easier? Reed thought about that, about the 4 years since the hospital steps, about the 1,000 small moments where Margaret had shown up exactly when she said she would, about the slow, painful process of unlearning the belief that everyone leaves. It gets different and you start trusting in pieces. Little things first, then bigger things. And some days you backslide and you're back to not believing anything. But the people who are actually safe, they don't get mad when you backslide. They just keep showing up. Maya was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question Reed had been waiting for, the one every kid in her position eventually asked, the one he had asked himself 100 times in the early days. How do you know if they're actually safe before it's too late? Before you've already trusted them and they leave? Reed thought about it. It was the hardest question because the honest answer was that you did not know, not for certain, not in advance. Trust was always a bet placed against incomplete information. But there were signs he had learned things that the safe ones did and the unsafe ones did not, and he tried to put them into words for her. The safe ones, he said, they don't ask you to trust them. The ones who tell you to trust them, who get hurt or angry when you don't, who make it about them, those are the ones to watch. The safe ones just keep showing up and they let you trust them whenever you're ready. Even if that's never. My grandmother never once told me to trust her. The first week I checked every door in the house to see if it could lock me in. She knew I was doing it. She never said anything except that she was making sure none of the doors locked from the outside. She let me check. She didn't take it personally that I needed to. That's how I knew. Not because she told me she was safe. Because she let me act like she might not be and she didn't punish me for it. Maya looked at her hands. I checked the doors too, she said quietly. I know, Reed said. That's how I knew what to look for in you. Because I see you doing the things I used to do. Maya nodded, did not say anything else. But before she left, she looked at him directly. The first time in the whole conversation, she had met his eyes and held them. And she said, will you be here if I want to talk again? Will you actually be here? And Reed understood that he had become for this girl the thing Margaret had been for him. The adult or near adult, the older one, the one who had made it, who could either show up or not, and whose showing up would either prove or disprove everything she was afraid to believe. The weight of it landed on him the way it must have landed on Margaret on the hospital steps. The terror of being trusted. The responsibility of a promise made to someone who had been failed by every promise before. Yeah, he said, I'll be here. Same place. You can find me at lunch. You can come by the counselor's office. You can have somebody pass me a note. I'll be here. He meant it. And he understood saying it, that meaning it was the whole thing, the only thing, the entire story had always been about. Not heroics, not 300 motorcycles or 4-minute recordings or federal warrants. Just a person looking at another person and saying, I'll be here, and then being here. Every single time, without fail. The counselor walked her out 10 minutes later. Reed stayed in the office, looked out the window at the parking lot, at the spot where 4 years ago Margaret's sedan had been waiting at 3:15. At the spot where every day since it had been waiting again, and again, and again. He took out his phone, texted Margaret, heading to the library to study. Home by 9. The reply came in 30 seconds. Dinner's in the fridge. Don't forget to eat. He smiled. The gap between his front teeth showed. He did not hide it anymore. That evening, Margaret sat in the sewing room, the room that used to be the third bedroom, the room where June's portable crib lived in the corner, and where Margaret's sewing machine occupied the center table, and where 31 years of fabric remnants filled the shelves in organized chaos. Each scrap a memory, each bolt, a season of her life measured in thread and stitch, and the satisfying sound of a seam closing properly. Her phone sat on the table beside her. She had a folder on it labeled Reasons. She had started it 2 years ago. Messages from strangers, people who had read about the case, parents whose children had been in Holden's system and had been found and returned, updates from kids who had aged out and remembered that someone had intervened. Rebecca Burnett had sent a photograph of Theo, now 15, at his school's science fair, holding a second-place ribbon and smiling. There were 43 messages in the folder, 43 reasons. She opened it sometimes. Late at night, when the shop was closed and Reed was studying and the house was quiet. Read them, reminded herself why the fight had been worth it. Her phone rang. Unknown number. This is Margaret. Mrs. Vaughn, this is Rebecca Burnett, Theo's mother. I remember. I wanted to tell you, the trial ended yesterday. Holden was convicted on all counts. 14 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility for 9. Margaret closed her eyes. 14 years. For a man who had treated children like revenue. For a man who had smiled at Rebecca Burnett from 3 rows ahead every Sunday for 3 years. For a man who had written useful window beside Reed Dixon's name in blue ballpoint and filed it alphabetically, and never once considered that the child whose life he was managing was a child. How's Theo? He's okay. 15 now. Still processing. But he's okay. He knows what happened, what Reed did, what your chapter did, what you did. I wanted him to know that people fought for him even when he didn't know they were fighting. I wanted to say thank you. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. Because you didn't have to show up. You could have taken June home and called the police and gone to bed. You didn't. You sat on a hospital step and looked at a child and decided he was worth fighting for. And because you did that, my son knows that someone cared. That matters. You can't know how much that matters. Margaret held the phone against her ear, thought about the hospital steps, about Reed's 5 words, about the door at the end of the hall, about all the small, ordinary things that had built a life out of the wreckage of a system that had failed them both. I didn't decide, she said. I recognized him. He was every child the system ever swallowed. He was my son. He was your son. He was all of them. They talked for a few more minutes. Rebecca told her about the support group she had found, about the trust fund for Theo, about the Sunday mornings at Cornerstone that she no longer attended because she had found a smaller church where no one smiled at her with the specific kindness of a man hiding a crime. When she hung up, Margaret sat in the sewing room for a while, did not sew, just sat. Her phone buzzed. Text from Reed, heading home. Need me to pick up milk? Margaret smiled. Type back. We're good. See you soon. She looked at the folder, at the 43 messages, at the evidence that showing up mattered. Not because it fixed everything, it did not. The system was still slow. The complaint process still took too long. Children still fell through gaps that should not exist. Clifford Holden was one man in one county in one state, and there were others like him. Other administrators who had learned to convert children's invisibility into revenue. Other systems that protected liability more efficiently than they protected lives. But showing up bought time, and time was the thing children in crisis did not have. Margaret had not replaced the system. She had stood in the gap between what should happen and what did happen. And sometimes that gap was the difference between a child making it out and a child disappearing into the paperwork forever. Russell had not made it out. Margaret had come home from a double shift to a phone call and a 3-paragraph letter and a system that told her that her son's death was not subject to review. She could not save Russell, but she had saved Reed. And through Reed's recording, she had saved Theo Burnett. And through the investigation, she had saved 12 other children whose names appeared in Holden's ghost files. That did not make Russell's death okay. Nothing would ever make it okay. But it meant that Russell's death had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of Margaret's reason to fight for every child who needed someone to stay. Every single time, without fail. Reed came home at 8:47, put his backpack on the hook by the door. The hook Margaret had installed 2 weeks after he moved in because she noticed he kept setting the backpack on the floor beside whatever seat he was sitting in, always within reach, always ready to grab. And she understood that the backpack would stay on the floor until there was a hook with his name on it. So she bought a hook and a label maker and put his name on it. Reed, all capitals, permanent. He had not carried the backpack everywhere since for him. Something smells good, he said. There's soup on the stove, bread on the counter. He went to the kitchen, served himself, sat at the table, ate without performing, without timing, without the careful, watchful consumption of a child who had learned that food could be taken away. He ate like a 16-year-old boy who was hungry after studying and who knew that the soup would be there tomorrow and the bread would be there the day after and the woman in the sewing room would be there every morning when he came downstairs and every evening when he came home. Margaret listened to the sounds of him eating from the sewing room, spoon against bowl, chair creaking, the refrigerator opening and closing. The ordinary domestic symphony of a life being lived in a house where someone was safe. She picked up her sewing. A hem. Simple. Straight. The kind of work her hands could do without thinking, the kind of work that left her mind free to wander through the territory of what had happened and what it meant and how the world looked different from this side of it. She thought about the hospital steps. About 4 seconds. About a 12-year-old boy who decided a stranger's granddaughter was worth dying for because he had calculated, with the cold precision of a child who had been taught by 9 years of abandonment, that his own life cost less. He had been wrong, catastrophically, beautifully, life-changingly wrong. And the proof of how wrong he had been was sitting in Margaret's kitchen, right now eating soup, doing homework, planning a future that included college and social work, and the fierce, quiet determination to make sure that no child ever sat on a hospital step alone at 11 o'clock at night, believing that their absence from the world would not cost anyone anything. She thought about all the people it had taken, not just her. Wade, who had made the call, Weaver, who had picked up the phone at 1 in the morning and asked only how many, Mercer, who had not slept, Graves, who had built the case, Caldwell, who had stood in a courtroom and filed papers at 8:47, Wren, who had taught her how to sit with a child who had learned that need was dangerous, Old Dutch, 73 years old, who had ridden through the night and shown a boy a black and white photograph of his own abandonment to say, without quite saying it, I know, and somebody came for you anyway, and that's the difference between my story and yours. Cheryl, the file clerk who had held the files, Donna, who had left out bread, Rebecca Burnett, who had finally agreed to speak, even Brennan, who had been too slow and had said so, and had then moved fast when fast was finally possible. It had taken all of them. That was the thing the story never quite captured. When people told it later, when it became a thing, people told the boy who took the bullet, the bikers who came. It made it sound like the work of a moment, a dramatic rescue, a single act of courage. But the rescue was not the moment in the parking lot. The rescue was the 10,000 moments after. The grilled cheese, the unlocked doors, the cereal choices, the 315 pickups, every single one for years. The patient, unglamorous daily labor of proving to a child that this time was different, that this time staying was real, and that labor had been done not by one hero, but by a whole web of people who had decided each in their own way that a child they had no obligation to was worth their inconvenience. That was the only thing that had ever saved anyone, Margaret thought. Not heroes, webs. People connected to people, each one willing to show up until the web was strong enough to catch a child the system had let fall. Margaret set down her sewing, walked to the kitchen, stood in the doorway. Reed looked up, soup on his chin, textbook open beside his bowl. What? Nothing, just checking. He smiled, the gap between his teeth, the smile he did not hide anymore. I'm here, he said. I know, Margaret said. So am I. She went back to the sewing room, sat down, picked up the hem, and in the quiet house on Oak Ridge Drive, in the room that used to be the third bedroom in the life she had rebuilt from the wreckage of the life she had lost, Margaret Vaughn stitched a straight seam and listened to her grandson wash his dishes and knew with the certainty of a woman who had survived the worst thing and found a reason to survive it, that this was enough. Not perfect, not healed, not the ending anyone would write if they were writing it from scratch, but enough. A boy who was safe, a home that held, a door at the end of the hall that was open, and a woman who showed up every single day without fail because that was all family ever was. Somewhere out there tonight, there was another child on another step, a child cycling through placements at regular intervals because someone was managing them like revenue instead of like a person. A child who had learned to be still because being noticed cost something. A child who had decided with the cold arithmetic of the abandoned that their own life was worth less than everyone else's. That child was waiting, whether they knew it or not, for one adult to walk down the steps slowly, to sit beside them instead of above them, to put a hand flat on the concrete and say, you have people now, and to mean it and to prove it one ordinary day at a time, if for as long as it took. It did not require a vest or a motorcycle. It did not require 300 riders. It required one person willing to see a child the world had taught itself to look past and to refuse to look past them. To ask the uncomfortable question. To stay when staying was inconvenient. To show up at 3:15 and the next 3:15 and the one after that until a child stopped counting the days until you would leave. Reed Dixon had been worth $1,850 a month to the man who controlled his life. He had been worth nothing to the 11 systems that had processed him in 9 years. And the only people who had ever seen what he was actually worth were a 2-year-old girl who would grow up knowing his name and a 62-year-old seamstress who had looked at him on a hospital step and recognized her own lost son, and through that recognition had found the thing that finally made the loss bearable. Showing up, staying, and meaning it when you said you would. That was all of it. That was everything. That was the whole of what one person could give another, and it was enough, and it had always been enough, and the only tragedy was how rarely the children who needed it most ever received it. Margaret stitched her seam. Reed washed his dishes. The hallway light was on, and the door at the end of the hall stood open the way it would stay open now for as long as a boy needed a room and a woman needed a reason, which is to say for the rest of their lives.